In its disorienting yoking of disjunctive registers, Lynch's novel calls to mind not only more recent genre-bending writers such as Carmen Maria Machado and Claire Bay Watkins, but the tradition of Gothic horror and its ambiguous relationship to the marriage plot in canonical works like Jane Eyre, through to the small-town horror stories of Stephen King and the postmodern meditations of Dr. Lillo. And I might want to throw in Vanessa Veselka's Zazen as well as a sister text, exploring how environmental catastrophes are once political and personal, internal and external, a disarrangement in the world that is also a disarrangement within. But I do no justice to the originality of Lynch's work by these comparisons. The Forbidden Territory of a Terrifying Woman is a powerful, uncanny, superbly constructed debut that reshapes how we think of the contemporary novel and redefines what is possible within the all too often reductivist genre category of sci-fi. Molly Lynch is an emerging Canadian writer who has published fiction in Granta and New Quarterly, among other magazines, and creative nonfiction in The Point, The Walrus, and elsewhere. She's been a finalist for the National Magazine Awards in Canada. She grew up on the West Coast of Canada and lived in Ireland as a teenager, worked in Europe, and traveled extensively through the Middle East before studying literature in Montreal. She received her MFA from Johns Hopkins, from the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars. She now teaches creative writing as well as literature courses on social justice at the University of Michigan. The Forbidden Territory of a Terrifying Woman is her first novel. We'll have a reading. We'll read for us, and then she and I will have a conversation that will then open up to art. So please join me in welcoming Molly Lynch.
Thank you so much, Roy. That was an incredible, incredibly flattering introduction, and hopefully I can live up to those incredible comparisons. So I want to read a couple of sections from the novel, but I thought that before I do, I might read a little bit from an essay that I've just recently published that worked as a companion piece to the novel, although it arrived as sort of a follow-up. And I wrote it after visiting Greece this summer, where I revisited a site that plays an important role in the novel. And after visiting it, I revisited some of the themes that really play out in the novel and felt compelled to write this essay. So I'll just read a bit of it to you, and hopefully it can work as a little bit of an introduction to some of what I think of now as being some of the themes that I'm working with here and the questions that I was trying to address. But this site is it's the ruins of a city on the island of Kythera. And the city had once been the center of civilization in the region. And it mysteriously came to an end. And the locals on the island, they have a very strong narrative about what happened there, a legend. And it's a terrifying legend. And in fact, it's where the title of the novel comes from, as the protagonist in the novel recounts her visit to this site. I won't get into the title of the novel right now. If you have questions about it afterwards, I can talk about it. But the site itself is quite a terrifying place. It's a city that was built above two deep gorges on this point that juts right out, and it was protected, but it was mysteriously abandoned, and the ruins are, beside the ruins are these precipices that sort of speak of something, of a terrible demise. And so the legend of the place is something that I wrote about in this essay, and hopefully it can speak for itself here. but the title of the essay is Maternal Vertigo. And I was interested in thinking about vertigo as I visited the place this summer and stood on the edge of the cliff with my child. And I was interested in thinking about vertigo not simply not as a metaphor, but actually as a sort of like psychic phenomenon, an event that happens internally when you get drawn to the edge. And I feel that there is something about that sort of internal experience that, to me, reflects part of what can happen when we think about the crises that surround our civilizations. And so, yeah, it's quite a remarkable sight because you're looking at a civilization that ended at the edges of two deep gorges. So I'll read from Maternal Vertigo here. I didn't plan to take my child to the ghost city. We went there spontaneously on our way to the beach. We were in Greece, on the island of Kythra, and we'd been driving along a road when I saw the sign for Palliahora, and I hit the brakes. I knew the legend of the place because I'd written about it in a recent novel. As the story goes, the city had been built on a narrow precipice between two deep ravines to protect it from pirates that roamed the Mediterranean. Hidden by the gorge from the view of ships, Palliahora thrived. But the famous pirate Barbarossa heard rumors of the prosperous city and coerced some shepherds to show him the way. He and his raiders attacked. While the men of Palliahora were being massacred, the women calculated their options and made a horrifying choice. Rather than be taken into slavery, they threw their children and themselves over the edge. At the end of the dusty road, I got out of the car. We were the only people there. From the back seat, my child called out, "Is this the beach?" I said, "Not quite." Wind was blowing wildly. A hill blocked my view of the ruins. But I was already imagining it. A world collapsing. Mothers clutching their children at the edge. But then it's easy for my mind to go such places. Sometime in the early weeks after becoming a mother, it occurred to me that by giving birth to a baby, I'd also given birth to chaos. I don't mean that my child embodied chaos. It was more like when the baby exited my body, a dark swarming force rushed in. By wanting to protect someone, I'd invited into my life all I could never protect him from. I've since thought that part of what changes you when you become a parent has to do with the way you encounter this contradiction. At the very moment you take on the greatest act of caring, you discover how powerless you truly are. Around the life of a small child, threats ripple out in concentric circles. The choking hazards and toxins of the home, the crosswalks and highways outside of the home, the seas, and so many things at once alluring and treacherous, like humans, capable of kindness and also stunning cruelty. Out and out go the circles, through the precariousness of the times we live in, with the forces of its politics and the things at stake in those politics, such as the inhabitability of the planet itself. In those early weeks, I became trapped between these opposing forces, protection, powerlessness, and the discord vibrated through my being. I couldn't sleep beside my child for fear of what might happen if I closed my eyes in his presence. When my husband took over and I slept in another room, it was with white noise, earplugs, a duvet blocking the crack in the door, and I was still prone to waking up from the slightest creak in the floorboards, adrenaline coursing through me, heart pounding, claws out, teeth bared. It was true that my child and I had both almost died during labor, and that event had most likely left me with a touch of PTSD. But there was a deeper unsettling in me. It came from my new dilemma, becoming the guardian of a life in a universe where I basically had no control. We talk about postpartum depression, but after comparing notes with others, I've come to think of that language as limited, if not entirely misleading. Postpartum total psychic reconfiguration feels closer to my own experience. But you could get even more specific, finding language for the initiation ritual in which you become acquainted with and humbled by the forces of chaos that determine so much of our lives. Ideally, when you have a child, you grow a thick skin and a good sense of humor. But it could easily go the other way. You could grow more anxious, more desperate to control environments, more edgy when the chaos creeps in. The steady, low-grade tension might be enough to make you want to flee. In my novel, The Forbidden Territory of a Terrifying Woman, mothers do flee. Against a backdrop of climate catastrophe, mothers around the world begin to dissociate and spontaneously walk away from their homes, their jobs, their families. This might seem like a sci-fi scenario, but the novel is actually a domestic drama, with the narrative centering on a family as they navigate the emotional fallout of the mother's vanishing and her attempt to re-enter their lives. During the question and answer period at a recent book event, an audience member asked me if I thought of the novel as a postpartum allegory. The story no doubt explores questions about motherhood, but that particular allegory hadn't been my intention. In fact, no allegory had been my intention. I had treated the story as a simple documentation of a family's experience of a crisis affecting the wider society. I hadn't treated that crisis as a metaphor. Instead, I imagined the mass abandonment of mothers as a symptom of a larger problem. In my own conception of it, the epidemic of mothers walking out on their civilization is a sign of a limit of that civilization, a sign of a breaking point. The mass abandonment is thus caused by something affecting us all. But after being asked the question, it struck me that the existential disorientation of our current times are themselves like some postpartum allegory. These times being ones when, if we choose to look, we might all recognize the vulnerabilities, the breaking points, the limits of the world we've designed. Times in which we consistently refer to things being unsustainable, resemble that postpartum self-reckoning. Ideally, when you tune into the threats you have no power over, when you recognize how helpless you are in the face of those threats, you'll grow a thick skin and a better sense of humor. But this, too, could easily go the other way. So, hopefully that can lead us into some of what you'll hear in fictionalized form. And I'm choosing a scene, I'm choosing to read a scene here that it's a little tricky to read because there's a lot of dialogue, but it struck me as a scene in which that world, with its threats, with its, with the sources of tension is flowing into the home. And I think in a way the novel is about this. I mean, I like your language, Roy, about the inside and outside and the way these things sort of flow in and out. And I suppose, with large issues, large crises, we can feel that way. The way they enter our psyches and the way they enter our relationships and our conversations. Oops. Hold on. I just lost my page. Let me see here. All right. So, just the tiniest bit of background for this section. Ada, the protagonist, has, in a previous chapter, ordered some iodine tablets, which are meant to protect your thyroid in case of nuclear fallout. They live in the Great Lakes region in Michigan, where there are many aging nuclear reactors that might collapse any day. All right. Iodine tablets arrived through the mail slot in a yellow padded envelope. They were called Iosat Life Extension, 20 tablets in foil. She put them on the counter beside the cutting board and chopped onions. She was making chicken soup. Last night's carcass was simmering on the stove. She imagined putting an iodine tablet on Jill's tongue, giving one to Danny, throwing some things in a car, and speeding west as radioactive plumes melted the earth behind them. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. As she sautéed onions, celery, carrots, she listened to local NPR. She almost expected a story about the bad nuclear reactor on Lake Erie blowing up. Instead, they talked about a phytoplankton crisis in the seas. They said that phytoplankton provide 80% of the world's oxygen, but they were being killed off by acids from pollution at a rapid rate. An alarming decline was how they put it. Jill came into the kitchen. "Do you know how to tell if you're running?" he said. "Just a sec," she said. She chopped time. The phytoplankton crisis was urgent, they said. Experts were linking it to the deregulation of industry around the world. More pollution was presently being dumped into waterways than ever before. "Mama, do you know how to tell if you're running?" Ada faced him. She felt apologetic. He started to explain with his arms and legs, showing her his feet rising off the ground. She saw Jill in a future time when there was no oxygen. She saw him moving through an airless world as he was moving now, moonwalking, arms and legs in some slow motion dance on this planet, but with no air. The pot on the stove was bubbling. Jill was right under it. "Be careful," she said. She maneuvered around his body to turn down the gas. Danny came in to help. On the news, they started talking about a group of migrant women being held in a Texas detention center. The guards had been smuggling the women out of the center and renting them, their bodies. "Oh my God," Ada said, "did you hear that?" "Can you lick your elbow?" Jill said. "Dada, can you?" Danny said, "I think so." Danny was straining to stop. "Dada, try it." Danny tried to lick his elbow. "I can't." "Can you, Mama?" Ada stared at him. His eyes were bright, round things, clear. "What?" she said. "Try to lick your elbow." Danny poured wine. "Do you want some?" he asked. "No, thank you," she said. "No?" It was Friday, game day. The stadium down the road was thundering. A vibration moved through the earth. "Mama, try to lick your elbow." Ada looked at her elbow. She waved her arms above her head. She licked at the air. She rolled her eyes around. Jill hooted with laughter. He lay down on his back on the floor, moving his arms and legs around like an octopus. "The new boy in my class can lick his elbow," he said. "His name's Ocean." On the radio, they had moved on to the day's market report. They sounded upbeat. And what about Raven Wallace, Ada said. I was waiting for them to talk about her. Did you hear about her? Who, Danny said. The woman from here who went missing, a mother of 3. She vanished from her home. Ocean has apps, Jill said. If she was a white woman, they'd be talking about her, Ada said. Was she kidnapped? They don't know because they're not investigating. They let all this time go by before they did anything. Dada, Jill said. Did you know that? Ocean has apps. Is Ocean the new boy in your class? Danny asked. He was scraping celery leaves into the compost bin. Yeah, the other new one, Jill said. He has 7 apps, but how many apps do I have? You don't have a phone. I mean apps, just apps. Ada said, who wants apps? Who wants apps when you can have maps? Jill laughed. I know what, he said. I'm going to make a map. He jumped up. This compost bucket is full, Danny said. And it's also full outside, Ada said. We don't even use our compost, Danny said. Why do we keep it if we don't use it? Well, we could just spread it all over the ground even if we don't grow a garden, she said. We'd grow a garden if we stayed here one summer. I don't want to stay here in the summer. Ever? Last spring, they'd taken Jill out of kindergarten 2 months early to go to Montreal and then to the west coast of Canada, Quadra Island. They'd been going back to Canada forever. Canada and other places. Greece. Ada sucked chicken broth from the ladle. It was hot. We should go to Greece again, she said. Take him out of school again? School of life, she said. Camp on the beach, in an olive grove. Get a pot to boil water, mats to lie on. The life of royalty. The first time Ada had gone to Greece, that's what she'd done. That was a long time ago, though, before she knew Danny. Later, she went to Greece with Danny. A few years after that, they'd taken Jill. Every time Ada had gone to Greece and walked in hills with wild thyme and goats and gone into an old woman's kitchen and eaten fresh cheese that had been whipped by a hawthorn branch and so on, Ada had felt her life open up. And when she was not in Greece, which was almost always, she felt that she was trying in some steady, unseen way to be in Greece. As she stacked soup bowls and pulled cutlery from the drawer, Danny's quiet grew quieter. Ada was familiar with this shift. He would slip into a place of unspoken irritation over something she'd said, and it would be up to her to crack the conversation open. She'd have to say, what? What is it? What's the matter? And he'd probably resist for a while, saying it was nothing. And yet he'd stay quiet. Eventually, after she'd pointed out the glaringness of his quiet, he would give in and tell her that something between them was hard. She'd listen, telling herself not to react. Take it, she'd say to herself. Don't be partisan to yourself. Why is your cause any more important than his cause? Be willing to change. In tonight's case, she knew that the thing he'd say would have to do with her never wanting to be in the place they lived. This was obvious. He'd say that it was really hard for him to feel good about what he was doing in his life, working all the time for some security in the family, trying to get tenure when she didn't even want to live there. He would be mostly right to point out that it wasn't exactly fair of her to always be fantasizing about some other place. He'd possibly be a little bit right that it wasn't fair on Jill to take him out of school all the time. But that one she'd have to resist. There were different ways to become educated besides aspiring for high test scores and competing with your friends to get into a so-called top college that wanted to train you to become a tech innovator or a market trader. Her joke about school of life would shift into something more serious, but she would try to avoid an all-out rant about how she didn't want Jill to believe that it was normal for adults to sit around, as they did in this particular country, having casual conversations about the cost benefits of their kids' private school or their health insurance, as if they couldn't wait to use that health insurance. Not to mention conversations about school shootings. It definitely wasn't normal for your parents to have to ask your new friends if they owned a gun or several guns before you were allowed to play at their house. A ball of defensiveness bloomed, spread through her body, and then, just as fast, was gone. I don't care, she thought, and she filled the bowls with soup and carried them to the table. She decided to light candles, dark green beeswax candles. A roar came from the stadium. She called to Jill, who'd gone into the other room and was busy drawing something. Either he ignored her or he sincerely didn't hear. She believed the latter, but she felt irritated. "I made this soup," she said, "for you." And so that section is coming in the lead up to her vanishing. And within that lead up, there's a kind of like escalation of this external stuff coming into her consciousness. And she is increasingly uncomfortable with her middle class life that is in stark contrast to the things that she's hearing on the news, essentially, which are pretty much just things I've lifted. Just listen to NPR and write, and you've got a lot of material. All right, so it's not a big spoiler, I don't think. No, I think it's been mentioned already, that she vanishes along with a number of other mothers. But this is not the last we've seen of her. She returns. And when she returns, a part of her trouble, the part of what is really troubling her, is coming from her attempt to recall what happened. She has no memory of where she went. And so I'll read a brief section of her sort of attempting to re-enter that life and that home after she's vanished for 2 weeks. No memory. Ada stood waiting for the kettle to boil, considering an obvious theory. She was wondering if, in her time of darkness, she'd been held hostage, trafficked as they called it, exchanged as flesh merchandise for cash, or meth, or something. Had she fled some truck stop motel in her kidnapper's oversized Chicago Bulls hoodie, keeping to the ditches and woods, until she found her way like a bloodhound back to her home, to her child, her love? Had she then immediately blacked out the trauma so as to save herself from some wild insanity? Memory repression, she knew, served a handy role in human survival. Had she just effectively erased some hellish horror so as to now spend her days wandering the rooms of this modernized Victorian house like a woman lobotomized? For days now, she'd been lying on the bed or on the wood floor, straining against the rigidity of her memory, trying to retrieve some glimpse of whatever had happened to her during the 2 weeks she'd fallen out of her life. She could remember Danny on the first morning that she'd come back, crouched in genuflection inside the kitchen door, trembling and staring up at her. She remembered a painful coldness in her joints. Before that, she'd seen the sun pouring red on the windows of Jill's elementary school, and though she was sure that she'd come from behind the school, she couldn't actually remember being in those woods. Her memories tapered into a darkness that grew hard like a shell, a walnut shell. But there must have been something inside that shell. Sometimes she saw flashes of veins against sky and silver blue dusk light behind the veins. The veins were like tree branches. She was slow to move this morning. Another morning of being home alone in the house. Or so she thought. She went into the back room. When she went into the back room, her study, she found Danny sitting there. He looked sad and blurry. She stood in the open doorway wearing a small t-shirt and nothing else. He glanced at her bush and her pelvic bones, bones like blades, and she saw what he saw, her foreignness in her own life, her swollen eyes and messy hair. He sat at her desk with her laptop open, reading things of hers, private things presumably. She shrugged to let him know that she didn't care. They looked at each other through the greasy, sad film that separated them these days. She said, "Did I come through the back door?" He stayed quiet. He stared at her with complicated eyes. "Do you think I came through the back door?" she repeated. "I'm asking you." "I don't understand what you're asking," he said. "You don't remember the morning you came back?" "I mean before that. I mean when I was gone. Do you think I was coming here and getting in through the back door to get food from the pantry?" "What?" he said. "Where did I get food?" "There were other people here," he said. "Your dad and Yvette were here. Your mum was here. Susie came here every day. Someone would have heard you." She nodded. She said, "I think I lost 20 pounds or something. I've never been so acquainted with my bones." She turned, showed him her naked ass, walked down the hall to the little storage room. The pantry, as she had called it ever since the season, 3 seasons ago, when she'd taken up what had seemed like such a self-consciously female activity and canned all the cherries and lovely apricots that grew on the trees in the backyard, only to throw themselves onto the earth. But that summer, she'd rebelled against that waste. It had been their 2nd year here. They'd had to stay in Michigan for 6 weeks that summer because of Danny's job, and Ada had canned in a rising ideological fever of preservation, canned with visions of apocalypse weaving into her narrative of canning. The same visions that were always too easily available to her. Cheap visions, she knew, but still, she subscribed. Social collapse, ecological collapse, everything snatched, grabbed, used, world on the brink. She remembered herself pitting the cherries, red juice running down to her elbows, mixing with her sweat. She remembered doing the job in her bra and underwear with determination and contempt for the idea of anything being wasted, ever. That idea then mixing with the irritation at the labor. But the task drew her in and made her righteous. She turned that gaze onto the wasteful world and conjured up visions of all the ways the world became trashed. The hubris of humans, fouling an earth. It astounded her. She would become a Gandhi, sandaled and caddy-clad, refusing to drink tea. "Quit your dirty tea habit," Gandhi had said to his people in the Gandhi biography she'd once read. In her case, it would be wine too, of course, and ice cream. "Sorry, son, no more fun. This place is too fucked for anyone to be having ice cream." But seriously, to be given an earth as a home, an earth of all things, and then to poison its waters, wring out its soil, shave its forests, waste its fruits, etc., etc. She went to war in her kitchen against her entitled, ungrateful society in a swarm of late July fruit flies. But the next year they went away to Greece, where she drank a lot of wine, ate lamb chops and ice cream with her little boy. Well, back here in Michigan, her own fruits, the apricots and cherries in the backyard, fell to the earth, rotted, became insect jam.
I'm glad you read that section from that essay that you read. One of the few I think of as always reliable pieces of writing advice that I try to pass on to my students is from Johns right into the metaphor. And it's this like gnomic thing, right? Students are like, what does that even mean? But I think what it means is exactly what you've done, right? There's like, okay, a mother's disappearing is a metaphor for something, but you didn't treat it, you didn't write it like a metaphor, you just wrote it like it's happened. But I wanted to ask if this is an interesting question for you, like, how did you start writing the book? Like, where did that come from? How did you know to fixate on that, or did you wander around with other things? So, like, how did the book take shape, I guess is the question.
I mean, I had the idea it started with, it's funny, memory gets mixed up. It started with, I had heard about a couple of women who had completely vanished from their homes in totally different parts of the world. This one fall, as I was returning to teach, and it was right around the time of, I want to say Hurricane Maria that destroyed Puerto Rico, and I connected these things. They sort of connected in my mind. I imagined that the vanishings were a kind of flight from what felt to me to be like a kind of unavoidable catastrophe happening in front of everyone's eyes as life was carrying on like normal, as everyone's going about doing all of their like cheerful capitalist living. And so as soon as I imagined imagined one woman in particular, Ada, being drawn essentially into a natural environment, the question arose to me like, so would this thing that she's feeling be affecting others? And would this phenomenon of her and some other woman disappearing be a wider thing? And immediately it just became like, well, yeah, imagine that. Yeah. And then it was sort of, I guess, in terms of going into the metaphor, it's like, okay, well, what if? And how would that play out in a very just day-to-day real life kind of experience that, in a home that resembles my own home in, many ways. So yeah, the kind of like going straight into the what if and taking it earnestly, I think it happened in the writing as soon as I started writing it.
And that's part of the book is this, as I mentioned, this maybe supernatural, whatever that means, event, or mysterious event, and the kind of the way that it's the rich, realistic texture of it happening. It's really powerful. There's another way that happens with the book, which is the thinking about the sort of overall structure, which is so Ada goes away and then comes back, and there's a way in which the overall structure of the book is very kind of mythic. It's almost, I mean, there's questions, I think live questions that subsist past the end of the book about what exactly happened when she disappeared, or how, there are different, she has an account that she constructs for herself, which is not corroborated by other women who had the same experience, or some of the, I guess, footage, some of the evidence for what happened, but her account of it seems deeply true to her. But so it's this process of going under to the underworld, or to going away and coming back and bringing with her, or at least in
Returning with a sign of what, do you
A
say?
boon,
Mhm.
like she learns something
Right.
through this passage, right? So it's this very kind of mythic structure, and yet reading the novel doesn't feel like, right? It never feels like I'm like going along a journey with an author who's like taking me on this mythic quest.
Right,
It
right.
feels like I never know what's gonna happen.
Mhm.
Like her leaving is a surprise, her coming back is even more so of a surprise, and then the way that she copes with the way that she and Danny both cope with the fallout of her having left, and the reverberations from that are the novel's very suspenseful
Mhm.
through to the end. And I'm just wondering, and this is, and as a writer, this is a kind of a terrible question, but like, how did you navigate that? Thinking about, I don't even know if you had a sense of the overall structure of the book as you're writing it. I guess, did you, and how did you navigate your sense of the overall structure with the, like, writing the, like, working the moments and the scenes? I don't know, just,
Mhm.
it's, yeah, how did you think of that?
Mhm. I mean, it is a tricky question because in a way, it just kept presenting itself to me, like the next part. I mean, the novel has 3 sections: the lead up to her vanishing, and then we move into Danny's experience as he wakes up one morning and she's left the bed in the middle of the night apparently, and he doesn't recall when that happened. And so then we enter his experience. I mean, I think really like brutal experience of trying to figure out what's happened and trying to protect their child from the fearful implications of this. And so in that first, I mean, I can speak section by section, is why I'm talking about this, because in the first part, I understood what was happening to her somehow. That she was feeling this, in a way, a desire to like enter the natural environment, to be in a way like saved by it, to have the tensions of the world, ameliorated by the experience of going in, all the way in to the trees, all the way into the soil, and this draw into nature, into the natural environment. Was something that really sort of wrote itself, scene by scene. It was like it was there, and then, and then how does she make dinner tonight? And then where is it on her mind now as she's trying to teach her class? And then, and then she goes and does some bit of wandering. All of these moments just kept sort of, like, it was like, so if you have this thing happening inside of you, then what happens in your day-to-day? Until she disappeared. And then afterward, the next section, it sort of also wrote itself, because I knew she was gonna, I understood that she had to return. Somehow, I can't recount for you how it was that I knew that she wasn't gone forever, because I wanted her back, and I wanted some of her recounting of that. And I had the questions in my head all the time. What's happening? Is it, are these mothers morphing? Are they turning into other species? I wasn't sure about that as I wrote the first draft. Or are they dissociating and just leaving their identity self and vanishing into the world? And so in writing it, I wanted to play out both possibilities, or these are sort of 2 possibilities that I see as being quite strong explanations that are pulling against each other. And I wanted to play them both out. And then in the end, as I was revising it, I wanted the reader to have the experience of having to sort of imagine both, of having to kind of ask the questions for themselves, and I didn't want to just give the sort of, like, I think there are, I don't spend a lot of time in like reading genres that give the kind of answer, but I know I've watched movies where it's like, oh, and this sociological phenomenon is happening because of this and that, and that's why. I didn't want to do that, give just a why to it all. I mean, this is straying from your question, but
No, this is
it's,
great.
yeah. Yeah, I guess the questions arise as you're writing, you know? And so the writing becomes a way of addressing those questions.
Let me look at my notes for a second. This is I don't know, you probably know, I don't know if you know, William Cronin's essay, The Trouble with Wilderness. It's this sort of like landmark essay where he argues that the idea of nature as wilderness, where nature is like this thing that's separate and protected from human manipulation, is an illusion, because even when we do that, we're managing it. And it's not only an illusion, but it's a harm, because it further separates us from the non-human world, and it keeps us from recognizing the ways that we're always surrounded and entangled with nature, with the non-human in various ways. And he talks about, he writes that we need to complicate this nature culture language and declare with Thoreau that in wildness is the preservation of the world. I'm going to get to my question in a second. For wildness, he writes, can be found anywhere, in the seemingly tame fields and the lots of Massachusetts, in the cracks of a Manhattan sidewalk, even in the cells of our own bodies. As Gary Snyder has said, as a person with a clear heart and open mind can experience the wilderness anywhere on Earth. It's a quality of one's own consciousness. The planet is a wild place and always will be. And so I couldn't help but think of this as I was reading the book, in the way that Ada and the other women, other mothers, lose themselves, not in national parks, not in the Tetons, but in the verge by the highway, or a city park, or just like these sort of liminal spaces that are tangled up with the human world. And it also made me think of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, which I often teach, and how in that book there's this alien part of the coast that's taking over the world, whatever. But it's sort of sneaking in to civilization through, like, potentially through, like, empty lots, like abandoned lots, and, like, these tiny, like, again, liminal spaces. There's something generative about those spaces. And so I wanted to ask about that, if you can talk about sort of Ada's liminality, like her desire to cross this boundary between human and non-human, in relation to like these spaces that are in and around the built human world. Where these spaces in the forest like call to her to disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, there's a lot in that question. The first part of what you were saying had me thinking one thing, and then I started thinking something else. But I was thinking about, to begin with, like, I feel that, the separation is something that is so false, and it's so at the heart of so many problems. And I feel that, our society, our civilization's relationship with the idea of nature, as well as with the actual physical environments of, natural environments and all species and all elements that are, is so confused. Like, I think we have a deeply deranged relationship with anything that's not human. And, and I feel that, part of the messes that we create, the physical messes, and all the messes, are actually they're themselves a part of it. They are, there isn't a separation even in the sort of polluting. It is itself a part of it all. But but then, you know, we have these ideas of a kind of those spaces that that humans aren't in or aren't a part of, that are sort of surviving outside of our grasp, and they manifest in urban spaces in a way that I feel to be like I guess fascinating and important myself. Like I feel, you know, I notice them, I'm drawn to them. And then I think Ada herself is drawn to them, and but she's drawn to them also in a complicated way. And she has a sort of, initially a kind of like she elevates the natural environment. And she is drawn to it in a way that feels like it might be a space of salvation. And I feel that part of her journey in this story is one in which she is really reckoning with that. Like, part of the mythic story is like, okay, so what would it mean to merge with the natural environment? What would that mean for you as a human? And I feel that it would mean that you give up your relationships with other people, and you give up your subjectivity, and you lose your mind in some way. And so that becomes a choice that she then later in the novel really has to confront when she goes into that space where she believes she vanished, and she really sort of allows the experience to return to her. She almost loses it again, loses herself again. I feel that, you know, in the sort of mythic narrative, that is the point when she's at a crossroads and making the choice between, you know, choosing the people in her life, or that space as a space of salvation, but it has become a space that threatens to take her away from herself. Yeah, so again, not a direct answer to your question, but yeah, I guess, I just wanted to, sort of add on to that I feel that, you know, a part of what she comes back to embrace when she finally does re-enter her life at the end of the novel is the mess. It is the human mess. And it's a part of what, you know, I feel like it is the dilemma for all of us. Like, how do we live with the mess? Do we run away from it? Or do we recognize it as being, this is a part of our human creation? The novel ends with a landfill.
Right.
She's facing the landfill.
Right. And it's very, like almost ecstatic moment.
Right.
Oh,
She's
yeah.
like cry laughing.
Right. Yeah. I have other, I have all kinds of other questions, but I also want to maybe open it up to the audience and see if there are some questions out here. We can throw more in if there are none, but yeah.
I noticed in the first passage, she was talking about her and her husband's composting and how even if they didn't have a garden, they could just spread it over the ground and that would be good. And in the second passage, she was discussing her thing with her canning, where she was sort of really upset by the cherries and apricots falling on the ground and just rotting. And I was wondering if there's an interesting like duality there where it's effectively like almost the same thing. It's the nutrients being returned back into the soil, back into the natural system. But at one time, she's wanting to preserve by taking it out almost, and at another time she's composting. I haven't read the book, so I don't know if there's more sort of interplay there, but that was really interesting, and I was wondering if you might expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've never read those two sections beside each other. You know, I never have like extracted 150 pages out and put them, and so, but I noticed it too. I was like, oh, the backyard composting and preserve. I hadn't noticed it myself, but I think the part about, I mean, I feel that maybe those moments are like moments in which we're seeing her fraught relationship with her own, like, how do I preserve, how do I like connect to the earth in my backyard, while, you know, living a life that pulls me away from that. And so I think in both of those moments, we're seeing some of that sort of inner, like, confusion of hers. And I don't think it's something that she has the right answer for. Like, I think she's, you know, there are contradictions that, like, she tries to preserve 1 year and then abandons that project and composts, but doesn't do anything with the compost, and isn't necessarily going to solve that problem for herself. But yeah, I like that you noticed that. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. I was so struck by the scene in the kitchen while making soup in the beginning, and just like the multiple conversations happening, and the way that the Ada is in the middle of these, and we don't really get a sense of, we don't get reflection on, like, the cacophony is making it hard to think or whatever. We just get, like, the cacophony and the multiple voices. And then there's just this marvelous point where she, like, decides to or maybe not even decides to, but focuses in on the question about the album, and, like, and answers the question that's really being asked, which is, like, can you get silly? Can you display some sort of, like, incapacity as an adult, which will delight a child? And I guess to get a question out of this, it would be like, does that return again in different ways? Like, is there a reworking of that kind of a scene, that kind of, like, overload and what cuts through, and how does the mother figure, like, interface with that once she's come back?
Yeah, that's a big part of the novel, is her relationship with her child, and this kind of, like, pull away from him and back to him, and she does a lot of play with him throughout the novel, and in the woods together, and they really go wild. And yeah, nature in the novel has many faces, and one of them is a space of, like, delight and excitement, and it's through her child that she really becomes a child and kind of abandons all of those worries and fears. And I think, yeah, as you know, a child can do, like, so just answer that question. Can you lick your elbow? Like, that's a really pressing one.
The best answer the child can get isn't a yes or a no. Isn't like, oh shoot, I can't. But it's like,
yeah,
like, that's the thrill. And what I love is that in that one scene, like, Ada's doing it almost automatically. Like, the joy is maybe implied, or maybe, like, the move toward play, like, happens without really visible, like, leaning into and feeling what the joy can be from that moment of moving into the play. And I just found that scene just, like, super effective in the spaces and ambiguity.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it was effective. No, I mean, that relationship is very important. It's everything in a way, you know. If there wasn't a child, then the stakes are just not as high, not nearly as high.
She could just go to wherever for half a year at a time.
Right. Yeah.
As you're pointing out, though, and there's some scenes in the book where it's that play that leads to the danger of disappearing. Like, it's the letting go of everything that sort of takes her to that space. And it's this interesting way that space, or is
Right.
able to, I think of the scenes in the woods. There's the one where they get lost for like hours, and then the one later in the book where she almost goes into the light,
Mm-hmm.
and he calls her back. And then there's another scene where they're playing in the basement
Mm-hmm.
in the dark, and it's after she's come back. They turn the lights out and they're goofing around in the basement. And he says, "I can see you. I can't see you, but I can see you. When you were gone, it was kind of like this." And so I don't know. Is there more you have to say? I guess can you say more about how you see play, and specifically Jill, and that sort of relationship as connecting to this disappearance or transgression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that a part of the tension that causes her to leave in a way actually has to do with him.
Yeah.
And it has to do with, and it's sort of what I'm getting at in this essay, that when you are caring for a child, it's like the ability to be afraid of things it just explodes. There are so many terrifying things to protect that child from. And it could make you crazy and make you like flee or want to flee, which is such an irony, such a sort of contradiction. But so when she returns, something has changed for her. And it's like she's gone into that fear and come through the other side, and she returns like a child. And it's super frustrating for Danny because she's hanging around the house like a teenager, making big messes and just like not doing anything. And she's really like irresponsible. She's sitting up late with Jill, and they're like playing, and she's confused about like, and so how do I take on that role again of being the mother? And she has to sort of find her way back into some balance there. But I think that a part of what her mythological journey again, or maybe the more psychological journey, has to do with actually like, that question of like grow a sense of humor. You have to grow a sense of humor if you're gonna deal with the things that will otherwise make you crazy and just make you so tense and try and control environments as a parent, but then also, as just a human in a world where there's so much chaos. You need to have some recognition that, yeah, things are crazy, and you're not going to control it. And you got to go with the flow of some things. And so I think that is a part of what she sort of that's a part of her transformation in this novel, is coming to a place as a parent with her child where she can play and enjoy and not be pulled away by her fears. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I haven't read the book, so stop me if any of this doesn't make sense. But you mentioned that they're in the Great Lakes District. There's all of these kind of ready to blow nuclear plants, like Cherry Republic and everything. But kind of writing about the climate crisis, which is like a global problem, how do you choose setting? And I guess how would setting have changed how this novel would have been written if you would like chosen somewhere completely different?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to me, I wrote it in the place I was at that point. And so but I think it's a really important question for all fiction, the where of it. I haven't actually thought about how this novel would have played out in another setting, but it's interesting. I mean, yeah, I guess I can only really speak to the way that I wrote this particular novel, which was that I treated it as though it was like this, the what if, imagine if here. imagine if in this house, imagine if on these streets. And so the setting was, you know, it was always there for me. Whenever I went outside, I could be going, oh, and then she goes into that cafe, and then it would be like that, and oh, and then she has this interaction with this person. So I just used the setting I was in, and it was like, yeah, and the nuclear reactors on Lake Erie are, you know, ready to blow, and yeah, so that's how I do that. But that doesn't mean that I think at all that a writer needs to live in the place that they're writing about, or be in the place that they're writing about. I think you can absolutely be right about all kinds of settings that you're not actually living in or existing in. Yeah.
In writing this novel, so there's like a bunch of parallels with yourself, and so I wanted to ask, like, what did you learn about yourself in writing this, and then also, like, what did you learn about writing in general?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you know, I was speaking about this a little bit earlier with someone, just, you know, some of the existential questions in the novel were personal questions for me, were ones, like, I was contending with fears about the world I was living in. And so I feel that a part of what, you know, I'm not like, I don't necessarily think of that writing needs to be therapeutic. I don't think that at all. I think writing is for all kinds of purposes. But there was a part of like imagining out a kind of like very dramatized like way of thinking about fear that allowed me to sort of look at my own relationships, my own relationship with fear, the fears that I had of the world, you know, frightening things happening in the world. And I feel that the novel did help me like get a little bit of a better sense of humor. I had been in a fairly like intense, dramatic place some years back where everything felt more catastrophic and more sort of like impending. And even though things are escalating now, I'm more like, this is the reality of being a human. Here we are. This is, yeah, there are like meteors flying through this, like, I don't know. I mean, I see things through a kind of lens of chaos, I suppose. Chaos is you know, what defines our existence. Anyways, so coming to terms with that, in terms of how like what I learned about myself, I think that's how I can answer that question. What was the other part of your question?
What you learned about like writing?
About writing.
This is
Yeah.
your first novel, right?
Yeah. I think I learned something about voice and just kind of like, you know, I've written a lot before writing this novel and attempted novels that didn't work. But in writing this one, it was like sort of allowing the narrative to embody the voice of whoever it was about. So I don't know, it was something about like letting the characters speak for themselves, even though they're not, you know, it's not like it's a third person narrative, but letting the sense of their voice come through. I don't know how to explain that exactly, other than it was like a bit of like, I needed to listen. When I wrote the Danny section, the middle section, I had to like wait. I had to just do some waiting for his voice to come through. And then it started to come through. I had to try different things and like, yeah, just imagine being inside his head in order to have his voice come through. Yeah, that's something I learned, is that I kind of want to wait for voice and have the story be led by the voice. Although I also want to try other voice. Yeah.
One once again, maybe this happens in another section of the book that we didn't see, but I noticed in the second passage you read, that her nudity is not a point of, I feel like it's a common trope that character comes in sort of not thinking about the need for clothing, and people around them are repulsed or disgusted, or at least think it's weird. And I noticed we didn't get any hint of Danny being weirded out by her nudity walking down the hall. She's acknowledging that she's showing different parts of her body to him, but we're not getting any, oh, you should put some clothes on or anything. I was just wondering, like, was that a conscious decision? What went into that? Because I think the trope would be to have him be like, why aren't you wearing, it's been 2 weeks, you should put clothes back on or whatever.
He's been kind of dealing with her, like, being in this sort of teenage mode. Not that that's something teenagers do, but she's just like incredibly careless when she returns. And she, right at this point, she starts to, the point that I read, from therein, she begins to sort of become a little bit more like, okay, how do I do this, right? And yet he's just so exhausted at that point. I think he can't even begin to be like, and you're laughing.
So yeah, it's not so much acceptance as it is, he just can't do the energy to be weirded out by it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's how I sort of understood him at that point. He's like, he's been through hell. It's the least of his worries.
Sorry. So you talked about kind of learning about voice and using that to trying to channel that before you really write a major part of the novel or whatever. I was curious kind of how you structured what or how you chose what parts to write, whether you wrote it in the like chronologically of how it happens in the book, or if you started at one point and then moved and wrote about an earlier part, or you focused on the part where she's gone. I don't know how you went about structuring where you wrote, where you like started, where you went from there.
Yeah, the novel is like, it's a lot of very short chapters, primarily. And for the most part, they were going in sequence, but later on I did some of this and got rid of some. And something about those, I don't know how that happened, writing those short chapters. It was just maybe about, like, I only had so much time at that moment. I was busy, and so I could only write that much. But yeah, and it did for the most part write from beginning to end, and then came back around and went through it all again and again and again. And now I'm writing another novel, and that seems to be what I'm doing. And I know that other writers do something different. They go very carefully through all parts and get to the end, and it's done. But I think I'm learning something about a process that for now seems good for me, which is to get the most of it down, then come back and, be able to do some of that. But mostly sort of chronologically. Yeah.
So you mentioned trying to write other novels and then not really working and trying things successfully. Can you talk about how you manage failure or like orient yourself to failure, use failure in the writing process? Like, what do you do with it?
Maybe think about it not as a failure, but as a kind of learning. I guess, I don't know, writing, I guess that's all, maybe that's all I can really say about that. I guess you do it because you want to do it. And wanting to do it involves wanting to learn about the craft. And so recognizing that is how you learn, by trying things. and trying to like, find your scent in a way and like get at something that, try many forms, try different things so that you learn craft. You learn, oh yeah, I can use this voice, I can use this, I can, switch this tense. Things like that actually, you're not failing when that doesn't work out. You've actually just acquired skills that you're gonna be pulling out. And maybe compare it to another art form, like music or something, where you practice and practice and practice and practice and learn and learn and learn and learn. And it's not failure to be practicing. Yeah, I think I suppose writing so much, there's so much focus on the end product, but the practice of it is really what it's about in so many ways. I think maybe in all ways. Now that I have the finished product out, now that I have the experience of what that is, how the book enter the world, people read it, people comment on it, and I'm like, okay, that's a blip in the, now I'm just want to keep writing.
I think I'll ask one last question. Was there any others out there? Can you explain the title?
Oh, yeah. So the title is, so Ada visits, or she recalls in the novel, the time she visited Paleophora. But she came down, she hiked down into the gorge, and she was going to hike up to the ruins, but on her way down into the gorge, she became inexplicably overwhelmed by fear. She couldn't go any further. And she didn't know the legend of the place. And she went on this like hour-long hike and then suddenly found herself running out, like terrified for her life. And then later learned from the landlady of the place that she was staying about this gorge and what supposedly happened. That mothers had thrown their children down into the gorge and themselves rather than be taken by pirates. And as she learns that, she's like, she feels this, she has this uncanny, like, it makes sense to her, the fear that she felt hiking down there. And then she thinks, then later, she learns about the Greek goddess Artemis, who's the protector of the wilds. And she starts to sort of narrate to herself that she imagined she trespassed into Artemis's realm by going into a place that the locals don't go anywhere near. They don't go anywhere near these gorges. It's haunted. But she just went trundling down there. And she then has a dream. So it's a very complicated thing that actually, but it makes its way into this segment in the novel. And she has a dream that she gets kidnapped by this all-powerful protector of a kind of terrain that she later imagines this woman that she encounters in the dream was Artemis, and she had trespassed on her territory, and it's the forbidden territory of this terrifying woman. And so the terrifying woman is the goddess of the wilds, who is merciless on anyone who trespasses upon her, and will take revenge. And so, I mean, we can think about the way that works metaphorically, in terms of our treatment of the natural environment. It might just come back in a terrifying form with catastrophic events.
And what I think about that, I love the layering of different narratives, self-narration, and these different things. But that, if I remember right, as she recounts the dream to some friends at a party, she talks about that, like, she accepted the punishment from Artemis, like, almost willingly. Like, there was like it was like this combination of it echoes so much through the book, right? Like this combination of fear and desire together. Yeah.
Yeah, she was basically she understood that if she was going to be free, she had to give herself entirely to this goddess. And upon doing that, she fell in love with the goddess and did give herself entirely, but then didn't want to be free. And so, yeah, there's, we can read this into that draw into the natural world as a place of salvation, or a place that might take you into itself and never let you go back.
Yeah. Well, it's a tremendous book. We have copies over there, and Molly will sign them, I
Yeah.
believe, if you ask nice. And so let's all have a big round of applause for Molly.
Thank you all for coming.